Drop a comment with your location and time. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Free support. Hit subscribe and like. What if the greatest crisis in modern history never happened? Not because it was averted at the last second, but because it was neutralized before its first move was ever made. There are no records, no public heroes, no monuments. There is only a ghost in the machine of history, a silent echo in declassified static. We have gained access to a fragmented data cache, designation Project Chimera. It details an event the world was never meant to know existed. An incident resolved before it ever truly began. Drop a comment with your location and time. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Free support. Hit subscribe and like. It began, as these things often do, not with a bang, but with a statistical improbability. Deep within a subterranean data nexus, a place shielded by tons of earth and concrete, a single analyst watched a waveform that should not exist. His world was the endless, roaring static of global background radiation, the residual whispers of the Big Bang, the chatter of a billion devices, the sun's constant solar wind. It was a symphony of chaos, and his job was to listen for a single discordant note. For 2,148 days, he had found nothing. On day 2,749, the chaos faltered. It wasn't a signal, not in any conventional sense. There was no transmission, no message, no spike in energy. Instead, there was a void, a perfectly patterned, mathematically pure absence of noise. For a duration of 3.159 seconds, a slice of the universal static across a specific frequency band became unnaturally ordered. It was the informational equivalent of finding a perfect sphere of vacuum in the middle of a hurricane. The system, a sprawling artificial intelligence designed to flag deviations, did not even register it as an event. It was too subtle, too fundamental. The AI was programmed to find needles in haystacks. It was not programmed to notice when a single piece of hay spontaneously rearranged its own molecular structure. But the analyst, a man whose name is a redaction in every official report, felt it. It was a prickle of unease, a violation of the natural order he had grown to understand intimately. He isolated the timestamp, rerouting petabytes of archived data through his terminal. There it was again, a ghost in the machine, a whisper of impossible order. He marked the event with a single cryptic notation: anomaly in the noise. He had no way of knowing he had just written the first line in the classified history of an incident that would be fully resolved before it ever truly began. The analyst's flag did not trigger sirens or alerts. It was routed to a quiet sub-processing division tasked with vetting low-probability, high-impact phenomena. Here, the anomaly was cross-referenced against every sensor array on and off the planet. The results were chilling. The patterned silence wasn't localized to a single sensor. It was a global event. Every deep space radio telescope, every signals intelligence station, every listening post from the Arctic Circle to the South Pole had recorded the exact same 3.14-second drop in random noise. The data was collated, creating a map of the phenomenon's footprint. It had a clear epicenter, a vast, desolate region of the planet designated Sector Gamma. But epicenter was the wrong word. It wasn't the origin of a broadcast. Triangulation attempts failed spectacularly, returning nonsensical, paradoxical results. The anomaly hadn't traveled from Sector Gamma, it simply was. It was a synchronized moment of impossible quiet that occurred simultaneously across the globe, yet its characteristics were most pronounced when analyzing the background data from that specific empty quarter of the world. Within 48 hours, the event was given a code name: Signal Ghost. The term was perfect. It haunted the global surveillance network, a presence defined only by its absence. It was a shadow, without an object to cast it. Paranoia began to fester in the secure chat rooms and encrypted video calls connecting the world's intelligence agencies. Was it a new form of quantum communication? A message encoded in the very fabric of static? Was it a systemic flaw in their multi-trillion-dollar monitoring infrastructure, a bug so deep it mimicked a law of physics? Or was it something else? The most disturbing theory, whispered only on the most secure channels, was that it was a symptom, a flicker in the world's operating system, a warning that something fundamental was about to go catastrophically wrong in Sector Gamma. The ghost was not the event. It was the echo of an event that had not yet occurred. The signal ghost was escalated. It bypassed traditional intelligence channels, moving from a technical curiosity to a matter of existential threat. This was not a problem for spies or soldiers. This was a problem for people who thought in different terms, who saw the world not as a collection of nations, but as a complex system of interlocking physical laws. A protocol that had never been used was invoked, Directive 734. This directive did not exist on any network. Its authorization was a physical key turn, performed simultaneously by 3 individuals on 3 different continents, who were unaware of each other's existence. Directive 734 was the silent assembly. Its activation was invisible. There were no troop movements, no jets scrambling. Instead, a series of seemingly innocuous events took place across the globe. In Bern, a theoretical physicist abruptly ended a lecture on string theory, walked out of the university, and left his life behind. In Kyoto, a bioethicist specializing in complex systems theory canceled all her appointments, citing a family emergency that did not exist. In a remote cabin in British Columbia, a reclusive logician packed a small bag after receiving a postcard with a picture of a bird that was not native to the region. They were followed by a cryptographer from Tel Aviv, a materials scientist from MIT, and a handful of others whose specialties are still redacted. They were not contacted or coerced. They were activated. Each was a dormant asset, a mind recruited years or decades earlier for a contingency they were told would likely never happen. Their instructions were simple, delivered through prearranged, untraceable methods. Follow a specific path, trust the designated contacts, and speak to no one. Their convergence was a masterpiece of clandestine logistics, a quiet gathering of intellects at a location that officially did not exist. They were the world's last line of defense against a problem the world could not be allowed to know it had. The assembly met in a room designed to be invisible. Buried deep underground, it was a perfect anechoic chamber, shielded from all forms of electromagnetic and acoustic surveillance. There was no technology in the room that was not strictly necessary. A table, 7 chairs, and a single light source. The air was cold, still, and recycled. As the 7 specialists took their seats, a panel in the wall slid open, and a man in a simple gray suit placed a single black folder in front of each of them before retreating. The panel ceiling shut behind him. For several minutes, no one moved. The silence in the room was absolute, a pale imitation of the unnatural quiet they had been gathered to investigate. Finally, the physicist from Bern opened her folder. The others followed. The contents were stark. There were no summaries, no opinions, no strategic assessments. There was only raw data. The first page was a visualization of the signal ghost, a clean, impossible sine wave carved out of a chaotic scribble of universal static. Subsequent pages showed the failed triangulation reports, the entropy charts showing a state reversal that violated the second law of thermodynamics, and the geographical focus on the desolate plains of Sector Gamma. But the final section was the most terrifying. It contained predictive models run on quantum simulators that had been secretly built for just this purpose. The models showed the signal ghost was not a singular event. It was a precursor, a harmonic tremor before a seismic event on a cosmological scale. The models predicted that within a specific time frame, a cascade failure would initiate within Sector Gamma. It was not an explosion or an invasion. It was a localized, expanding dissolution of causality. The fundamental constants of the universe would begin to fluctuate. The incident finally had a name and a horrifying definition. Their task, outlined on the final single sheet of paper, was not to stop an attack. It was to find a way to stabilize reality itself before its unraveling began. Inside the lead-lined walls of sublevel Gamma, the signal was no longer a ghost. It had a voice, albeit a fractured, whispering one. The initial anomaly detected by the deep Earth sensors had been isolated, amplified, and fed into the Aegis Directorate's primary analytical engine. The team, a collection of pale figures who measured their lives in server uptime and encrypted data packets, called it the Echo. It wasn't a transmission from the past or from a distant star. The horrifying truth that began to coalesce in the sterile, refrigerated air was that the Echo was a ripple propagating backward from the future. The data was a chaotic collage of what was to come. At first, it seemed like noise, but the pattern recognition algorithms began to pick out terrifying fragments of coherence. There were snippets of news broadcasts describing events that hadn't happened, stock market data for days that didn't yet exist, and satellite weather patterns for storms that had yet to form. But it was all distorted, like a reflection in troubled water. The reports mentioned cities that were slightly misnamed. The financial data contained impossible fluctuations, and the weather maps showed coastlines that had subtly, unnervingly shifted. It was the ghost of a future, a potential reality so catastrophic that its very occurrence sent shockwaves through the fabric of space-time itself. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead chronolinguist, described it as temporal shrapnel. The team was not merely observing. They were standing at the edge of a crater, looking at the debris of an explosion that was still years, or perhaps only months, away. The central question hung in the silent room, heavier than the shielded blast doors. What kind of event could possess enough energy to break causality? What future was so terrible that its echoes could be heard in the present? The mystery was no longer about detection, it was about comprehension. They were staring at the shadow of a monster, trying to discern its shape before it emerged from the darkness. The instruments that first heard the echo were not pointed at the sky. They were buried in the planet's deepest wounds, far from the electronic noise of civilization. This was Project Chimera, a clandestine network of quantum-entangled resonance chambers officially tasked with monitoring seismic precursors and exotic neutrino flux. Its true purpose, known only to the highest echelons of the Aegis Directorate, was far more esoteric. The Watchers, as the technicians called them, were sunk into the abyssal plains of the Pacific, encased in pressure-resistant spheres and anchored to tectonic plates. Others were lowered into the boreholes of decommissioned diamond mines in Siberia and the salt domes of the Gulf Coast. They formed a global subterranean nervous system designed to listen for whispers not of this world, or perhaps not of this time. These were not simple microphones or sensors. Each Watcher contained a core of stabilized exotic matter, a substance that existed in a state of perpetual quantum superposition. In theory, this allowed them to be sensitive to the most subtle gravitational and temporal fluctuations, the very background hum of space-time. For years, they had recorded nothing but a predictable, steady stream of quantum noise and the deep groans of the Earth's crust. They were a multi-trillion-dollar gamble on a fringe theory, a silent global sentinel waiting for a threat that science insisted could not exist. Then the anomaly had appeared, a synchronized, non-local perturbation across the entire network. A signal that defied the laws of physics, originating from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a chord struck in the future, and the Watchers, with their quantum sensitivity, were the only instruments on Earth capable of vibrating in sympathy. The men and women who monitored the data feeds from these deep, dark places were a special breed, accustomed to isolation and the crushing silence of their work. They were the true Watchers in the deep, the first line of defense against an impossible enemy, operating an invisible shield they prayed would never be needed. The raw data from the Watchers was a torrent of impossibilities, a storm of temporal static. Human analysis was useless. The scale was too vast, the patterns too complex. The entire burden fell upon a specialized quantum AI housed 60 stories beneath Langley, an intelligence codenamed Oracle. Oracle's primary function was to model unthinkable scenarios, to game out extinction-level events with a cold, inhuman logic. Now it was being tasked with its most paradoxical mission: to map a future that had not yet occurred, using only its distorted, backward-traveling shadow. The analysts fed the echo into Oracle's core, and the machine began to work. On the central holographic display in the command theater, the data began to resolve itself not as a linear chart, but as a swirling, multidimensional cloud. They called it the probability fog. Each particle of light within the fog represented a possible future, a potential timeline. Most were chaotic and unstable, flickering in and out of existence, but somewhere within that roiling storm was a point of convergence, a place where countless potential timelines collapsed into a single high-probability event, the source of the echo. It was a form of digital archaeology performed on tomorrow. The team worked in shifts, their faces illuminated by the ghostly light of the fog, guiding Oracle's search parameters. They were looking for constants, for elements that appeared across multiple distorted fragments of data. They cross-referenced the garbled news reports with the impossible stock data, searching for a common thread. The psychological toll was immense. The analysts were not just processing data. They were living inside 1,000 dying futures. They saw glimpses of cities in ruin, heard the panicked cries of millions in corrupted audio files, and felt the weight of a catastrophe they couldn't yet name. Oracle was the map, but they were the explorers, navigating a terrain of pure potential, searching for the epicenter of an earthquake that was still gathering its strength, deep in the bedrock of a future they had to prevent. Within the shielded walls of Site Upsilon, the threat had no name, no physical form. It was a phantom haunting the periphery of quantum simulations. Dr. Aris Thorne, a theoretical memeticist whose work was so classified, his own family believed he was a mid-level logistics manager, called it cognitive Hecatomb. In the hushed, climate-controlled briefing rooms, it was simply the vector. They weren't tracking a virus or a chemical agent. They were tracking an idea, a uniquely virulent, self-propagating concept that, according to every predictive model, behaved like a biological contagion but infected the mind. The simulations, run on esoteric computing architecture buried deep beneath the Utah salt flats, were terrifyingly consistent. Initial exposure, what they termed the index conceptualization, would lead to a near instantaneous and irreversible shift in the host's perception of reality. From there, the model showed a logarithmic spread, not through speech or text, but through something far more subtle. Observable behavior, a slight change in gait, a specific cadence in public spaces, a shared, unconscious glance between carriers. The vector would bypass rational thought, embedding itself directly into the subconscious. The infected wouldn't know they were infected. They would simply feel a profound, unshakable sense of purpose that superseded all prior loyalties, beliefs, and relationships. It was a theoretical contagion that promised societal collapse, not through violence or chaos, but through a silent, terrifying unity. A complete erasure of individuality, replaced by a single, monolithic will. The analysts at Upsilon watched the simulations run again and again, each time tweaking the initial parameters, each time hoping for a different outcome. But the result was always the same. A global-scale event horizon from which no information, no distinct human consciousness could escape. The incident wasn't a possibility. The data showed it was an inevitability, a storm gathering in a dimension of thought we were never meant to navigate. The response could not be conventional. You cannot quarantine an idea. You cannot develop a vaccine for a paradigm shift. Out of this stark reality, the Chimera Protocol was born. It wasn't a contingency plan. It was a philosophical weapon, a dark piece of statecraft designed to operate in the conceptual realm. Declassified fragments of the protocol read less like a military directive and more like forbidden text, blending advanced psychological warfare with predictive analytics that bordered on divination. The core principle was ideological inoculation. Chimera wasn't about destroying the vector. It was about preemptively seeding the global consciousness with a series of carefully crafted counter-memes. These were not simple propaganda. They were complex, multi-layered narratives, aesthetic movements, and even nonsensical viral trends, all designed to create a kind of cognitive static. This static would make the collective unconscious resistant, unable to receive the pure signal of the primary vector. The protocol's execution was to be threefold. First, Operation Midas, the manipulation of global financial markets to create subtle but pervasive economic anxiety, redirecting societal focus toward material survival. Second, Operation Babel, the amplification of social and political polarization through automated information channels, fracturing the global conversation into 1,000 incoherent shards. The goal was to ensure no single unifying idea could ever take root. The final, most sinister layer was Operation Somnus, a program to subtly alter entertainment and media, introducing subliminal patterns and narrative dead ends, designed to foster a sense of apathy and narrative exhaustion on a global scale. It was a protocol to make humanity too tired, too distracted, and too divided to ever be susceptible to the kind of profound unity the Vector promised. To save humanity, the Chimera Protocol dictated that they must first break its spirit, atomize its focus, and poison the wells of its shared understanding. It was a controlled demolition of collective consciousness. The Chimera Protocol was a shield, but the architects of the program needed a sword. They couldn't wait for the contagion to manifest. They had to prevent the index conceptualization itself. They had to hunt a shadow before it was ever cast. This task fell to a clandestine unit, known only as the Sentinels. Their operational theater was not the physical world, but the digital and cognitive ether. Using the predictive engines at Site Upsilon, they began sifting through the totality of global data streams. They weren't looking for keywords, threats, or known associates. Their algorithms were designed to detect something far more abstract: the nascent formation of a unique cognitive signature. They analyzed global academic research, anonymous forum posts, private correspondence, library records, and even brainwave data from commercial neurofeedback devices. They were searching for a specific convergence of intellectual disciplines, personality traits, and environmental factors that the models predicted would be the crucible for the Vector. The target was not a person, but a potential. A mind that possessed the unique combination of genius, isolation, and philosophical inclination to stumble upon the catastrophic idea. The Sentinels operated from a state of total paranoia. Every breakthrough in theoretical physics, every philosophical treatise, every piece of avant-garde art was a potential warning light. They were the silent, unseen guardians of humanity's intellectual boundaries, tasked with ensuring no one ever thought the wrong thought. Their work was a chilling exercise in pre-crime, taken to its ultimate extreme. They were profiling souls, looking for the one mind in 8 billion that was on the verge of a discovery that would end the world. The surveillance was absolute, a panopticon, watching not for dissent, but for the spark of a particular kind of genius. In heavily encrypted reports, potential targets were referred to not by name, but as progenitor candidates. Their lives mapped and analyzed with a terrifyingly detached precision, waiting for the moment their intellectual trajectory aligned with the doomsday variable. At the heart of the Sentinel program was the machine that made the hunt possible. It was never given a formal name, but its creators called it the Paradox Engine. It wasn't a computer in any conventional sense. It was a closed, time-like curve quantum simulator, a device that didn't just predict the future, but experienced it. By running trillions of entangled simulations in a state of quantum superposition, the engine could map out probable futures with unnerving accuracy. Its sole purpose was to solve the progenitor candidate equation, to find the specific individual who would, with a 99.999% certainty, be the origin point of the cognitive hecatomb. The paradox was its defining feature. To identify the individual, the engine had to simulate the future in which they succeeded. It had to watch the world end over and over in countless variations, tracing the intellectual lineage of the Vector back to its source each time. The data it produced was therefore a ghost, an echo from a future that could never be allowed to exist. the ethical implications were staggering. The person the engine identified would be, in the present timeline, completely innocent. They would have committed no crime, nor even conceived of the idea they were destined to create. Yet, the engine's data would condemn them. For months, it ran in its cryo-cooled cavern, its quantum core processing timelines at a rate beyond human comprehension. The Sentinels could only watch the probability vectors slowly converge. Then, on a Tuesday in early spring, it stopped. The simulations collapsed into a single, terrifyingly stable result. The engine had found him. It produced a single file, a name, an address, a profession, and a complete psychological and intellectual profile. It was a man no one had ever heard of. A quiet, unassuming academic. The Paradox engine had cast its judgment, pointing from a future of silent apocalypse to a single, unsuspecting mind in the present. The shadow now had a source, and the hunt could truly begin. The air in the subterranean control room, known only as the Nidus, was colder than usual. It was a manufactured cold, the kind that seeped from humming server racks, and the silent, unblinking lenses of ceiling-mounted cameras. On the primary display wall, a cascade of predictive models, once a chaotic storm of branching possibilities, had finally coalesced. The storm had passed, leaving behind a single, terrifyingly stable timeline. Analyst Kaito Tanaka, his face illuminated by the stark white light of the data stream, pointed a trembling finger. "There," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the low thrum of the facility. "Convergence at 99.9 recurring. It's locked." The point of inevitable genesis had been reached. This wasn't a prediction anymore. It was a post-mortem of a future that hadn't happened yet. The system, codenamed Kronos, had digested trillions of data points. Financial transactions, encrypted communications, satellite movements, even subtle shifts in public sentiment scraped from the ether, and concluded that a specific catastrophic event was no longer a probability. It was a mathematical certainty, a future baked into the present. The operators in the Nidus were not watching a potential threat develop. They were witnessing the embryonic stages of a ghost. The event's key actors, still oblivious in their homes and offices across the globe, were now just variables in a completed equation. Their free will had been rendered statistically irrelevant. Director Thorne stood behind the analysts, her reflection a distorted silhouette on the polished black floor. She stared at the timeline, a stark red line cutting through the next 72 hours. "Run the secondary and tertiary simulations. Isolate the Genesis nodes," she commanded, her voice betraying no emotion. But her knuckles were white where she gripped the back of a chair. The Genesis nodes were the people, the moments, the decisions that formed the bedrock of this future. Kronos began to highlight them. A financial transfer scheduled for dawn, a seemingly innocuous phone call between two continents, a travel booking for a non-existent conference. Each was a small, mundane act that would unknowingly weave together to form a tapestry of unprecedented destruction. The machine was showing them the architects of a cataclysm who didn't even know they were building anything. The protocol was clear, written in cold, sterile language within a binder that never left a lead-lined vault. Once the point of inevitable genesis was confirmed by 3 separate simulation models, Protocol 7, Aegis Inversion, was to be presented. Director Thorne sat alone in a soundproofed briefing room, the digital file open on a hardened tablet before her. It wasn't a plan for an assault in the traditional sense. There would be no soldiers, no explosions, no overt display of force. Kronos did not deal in such crude instruments. The preemptive strike it designed was a thing of shadow and whispers, a surgical strike against the narrative of the future. The debate was not with a committee, but with herself. The faces of the primary Genesis nodes stared back at her from the screen. A university professor, a logistics manager, a retired civil engineer. According to every piece of current intelligence, they were unremarkable, unconnected citizens. Yet Kronos insisted they were the linchpins. To authorize Aegis inversion was to accept the machine's judgment as absolute, to ruin lives based on a crime that existed only as data. It was the ultimate ethical tightrope walk. Her authorization was a simple cryptographic key, entered into a terminal. A single string of characters that would unleash a cascade of digital phantoms. The archived audio from her authorization is chilling in its brevity. Thorn, command level. Authorize Aegis inversion. Execute on all primary and secondary nodes. Timestamp and confirm. The response was not human, but a synthesized voice from the Nidus mainframe. Authorization confirmed. Aegis inversion active. The future is being revised. The strike was now in motion. It was a campaign fought not on a battlefield, but in the unseen networks that connect our world. It targeted trust, communication, and certainty. The objective was not to eliminate the actors, but to dismantle the framework of their future collaboration, to make their convergence impossible by poisoning the soil in which it was meant to grow. The system would turn their own digital footprints against them, weaving a web of suspicion and confusion so dense that their original catastrophic purpose would be lost within it. An unrealized thought. The countdown had begun. Not to the incident itself, but to the moment it was supposed to have happened. In the Nidus, the main screen was now a mosaic of surveillance feeds, a god's eye view of lives being subtly dismantled. The clock in the corner didn't display the time of day, but a stark, white countdown. 48 Keller. The preemptive strike was in full, silent swing. The operators, known as weavers, moved with quiet efficiency. They were not hackers in the conventional sense. They were narrative surgeons. One weaver, using a secure portal, initiated a complex algorithm that flagged the logistics manager's overseas accounts for suspicious activity, triggering an automatic, multi-day freeze by his financial institution. The transfer that Kronos had identified as a key step was now impossible. Simultaneously, another weaver accessed the university professor's cloud storage, not stealing data, but adding it, a single, corrupted file, expertly crafted to appear as if it had been there for months. When opened, it would do nothing but subtly alter key dates in his digital calendar, creating scheduling conflicts for meetings that were, according to Kronos, critical for the incident's planning phase. Every action was small, deniable, and untraceable. They were digital gremlins, introducing just enough friction into the system to make it fail. The targets felt nothing overt. They experienced only a series of frustrating, seemingly random inconveniences. A flight confirmation that never arrived. A crucial email that was mysteriously rerouted to a spam folder. A secure message that arrived garbled and unreadable. The weavers watched them through public webcams, phone microphones, and network traffic analyzers, monitoring their growing frustration. They were puppets whose strings were being systematically cut. Yet they were still trying to dance. The atmosphere in the nidus was one of profound, almost clinical detachment. The Weavers were simply executing a program, mitigating a threat vector. But the tension was palpable. They were actively interfering with people who had, as of yet, done nothing wrong. They were acting as judge and jury for a future crime. Their only evidence, the unwavering certainty of the machine they served. The second phase of Protocol 7 was the most insidious. While the Weavers were busy creating logistical chaos, a specialized sub-program of Kronos initiated the Whisper campaign. Its purpose was psychological, designed to sever the nascent bonds of trust between the Genesis nodes before they could ever solidify. The system began by analyzing the digital communications patterns of the key actors, identifying their insecurities, biases, and pressure points. Then it began to whisper. It didn't send threats or warnings. It sent carefully crafted pieces of disinformation, disguised and delivered through channels each target would implicitly trust. The retired civil engineer, a man known for his paranoid tendencies, received an anonymous email. It contained a fragment of a real encrypted conversation from one of his collaborators, but with 2 words subtly changed. The alteration was minor, but it completely inverted the meaning, transforming a message of solidarity into one of potential betrayal. For the university professor, the system planted a fabricated news article on a niche academic forum she frequented. The article, seemingly well-researched, profiled an anonymous figure whose career was ruined by a failed, radical plot, with biographical details that were uncomfortably similar to her own. It was a ghost of a future she might be heading towards, a warning disguised as a case study. The campaign was a masterclass in social engineering. It used AI-generated sock puppet accounts to create echoes and validation for its narratives. It manipulated search engine results so that if a target grew suspicious, their own research would lead them down a rabbit hole of curated misinformation that only confirmed the planted fears. The nodes, who had never met in person, began to doubt one another. Communications became strained, accusatory. They saw betrayal where there was none, and incompetence where there was only manufactured friction. The Whisper campaign was the true preemptive strike, not against actions, but against intent. It dismantled the very idea of the incident in the minds of its would-be perpetrators. They were being defeated by an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy that knew their deepest anxieties better than they did themselves. The grand design was dissolving into a fog of mutual distrust. The air in the Chimera control room was colder than thermodynamics allowed. It was the cold of absolute finality. On the central screen, the Calabi-Yau manifold, representing the target temporal coordinate, pulsed with a malevolent crimson light. This wasn't a physical location. It was a moment, a single fragile decision point nested 37 years in the past. The target was not a person to be eliminated, but a thought to be unthought. The entire apparatus of Project Chimera, a multi-trillion-dollar ghost program buried so deep it existed outside of official budgets, was aimed at this one synaptic firing in the mind of a low-level materials scientist who was, at that moment, deciding whether to take a coffee break or run one more simulation. That simulation was the seed of the incident. The solution was not a bullet, but a whisper. A precisely calibrated quantum informational pulse encoded with a cascade of distracting data. A phantom anomaly in his results, a flicker of a family photo on his monitor, a fabricated urgent email, anything to break his concentration and steer him toward the coffee pot. The lead chrononaut, Dr. Eris Thorne, stood motionless, his reflection a pale ghost in the polished black floor. He gave a single, curt nod. The operator, her face illuminated by the green glow of her console, initiated the sequence. There was no sound, no explosion, no flash of light. Just a single line of code executing, sever.branch sigma. For a harrowing 4.7 seconds, reality felt thin, like stretched fabric. The monitors flickered, displaying static and impossible geometries. Team members felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, a phantom memory of a life they hadn't lived warring with their own. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The crimson light on the main screen collapsed into a serene, stable blue. The probability vectors, which had shown a 99.8% certainty of catastrophe, now flatlined at 0. They had done it. They had performed the most profound act in human history. They had murdered a timeline to save their own. And the only evidence was the sudden, chilling silence in the room and the shared, unspoken knowledge that they were now strangers in a world of their own making. Victory was not a celebration. It was a vigil. In the days and weeks following the temporal severance, the Chimera team became obsessive archivists of a history that was no longer happening. They monitored the new timeline with a suffocating intensity, watching for the ghosts of the averted future. Their surveillance network, designed to detect the faintest precursors of the incident, now returned only silence. The key players who were destined to orchestrate the global crisis never crossed paths. A chance meeting at a Zurich conference, the catalyst for their dark alliance, was erased. One of them missed a flight. The other accepted a different job offer a month earlier due to a minor, unrelated market fluctuation triggered by the intervention. The critical technological breakthrough that underpinned the incident never occurred. The research team responsible was disbanded after their primary funding was diverted to a more promising and benign project. The political climate, once a powder keg, cooled. A key election swung the other way by a few thousand votes in a single district, leading to a foreign policy of de-escalation rather than confrontation. It was a cascade of non-events, an avalanche of the mundane. The world kept turning, blissfully unaware of the bullet it had dodged. For the Chimera team, this profound quiet was more unsettling than the impending doom they had fought. Their success was measured by an absence, a void. Every normal news day, every report of traffic jams and stock market trends, instead of emergency broadcasts and martial law, was a testament to their invisible triumph. They were the sole audience to the greatest show that never was. They watched intelligence chatter that remained placid, satellite imagery that showed peaceful cities, and economic data that reflected a stable, unthreatened world. The silence was their monument, the normalcy, their reward. And as the world slept soundly, they remained awake, haunted by the deafening peace they had created, forever watching for the echo of a scream that was never uttered. The second directive of Project Chimera was as absolute as the first. Upon successful alteration of a timeline, the project must cease to exist. The saviors had to become ghosts. The process was codenamed Lethe, after the mythological river of forgetfulness. It was a systematic, ruthless campaign of self-annihilation. The physical hardware, a quantum entanglement array housed in a subterranean facility beneath the Utah salt flats, was the first to go. It wasn't dismantled, it was transmuted. Specialized thermic charges melted the exotic alloys and quantum processors into a single, unrecognizable slag of inert metal, which was then encased in concrete and buried under a newly designated nuclear waste site. No one would ever dig there. The digital footprint was infinitely more complex. Petabytes of data, simulations, personnel files, surveillance logs of the erased timeline were not merely deleted. They were overwritten with layers of junk data, then fragmented and scattered across thousands of obscure, forgotten government servers, hidden within benign files like agricultural reports and census data from the 1970s. The algorithms used to wipe the servers were designed to mimic natural data corruption, leaving behind no trace of deliberate erasure. The most difficult part was erasing the people. The 47 essential personnel of Project Chimera underwent a process of biographical deep cover. Their real identities were digitally incinerated. Service records were altered, educational histories fabricated, and new lives were constructed with painstaking detail. A chrononaut became a mid-level accountant in Des Moines. A quantum physicist became a high school science teacher in rural Oregon. They were given new names, new histories, and a severance package that was both a fortune and a gag order. They were forbidden from ever contacting one another again. They were to live out their mundane, fabricated lives, carrying the secret of their monumental act in total isolation. The final step was turning off the lights. Dr. Thorne was the last to leave the control room, now stripped bare to the concrete walls. He placed his hand on the final power conduit, the only thing left connecting the facility to the outside world. He pulled the lever, and the last hum of machinery died, plunging the tomb into an eternal, silent darkness. What is the weight of a world saved? For the scattered remnants of Project Chimera, it was unbearable. They lived in the quiet, peaceful world they had bought and paid for with a history no one else remembered. This was the true cost, the long-term psychological fallout of their success. They were afflicted with what internal documents had termed temporal dissonance syndrome, a profound and incurable sense of dislocation. They walked through cities that should have been ruins, past smiling people who should have been casualties. Every mundane headline in the morning paper was a ghost, a pale replacement for the catastrophic news that should have been printed. An accountant, formerly the project's lead data analyst, would flinch at the sound of a passing airplane. His subconscious still braced for the sirens of the timeline that wasn't. The Oregon science teacher, once a brilliant physicist, would stare at the stars, not with wonder, but with a deep, aching memory of orbital weapon platforms that were never built. They were living paradoxes. They possessed knowledge of dangers that no longer existed, and memories of events that had never occurred. They could never share their burden. To speak of it would be to invite ridicule, disbelief, and institutionalization. Who would believe the quiet man down the street single-handedly averted Armageddon? Their heroism was defined by its absolute invisibility. There would be no medals, no monuments, no solemn holidays of remembrance. Their only memorial was the continued, uninterrupted, and blissfully ignorant existence of humanity. This unseen salvation was a private hell. They were guardians of a secret that protected the world, but isolated them from it entirely. They were heroes condemned to live as ordinary people, forever haunted by the echoes of a war they won before it ever began. The incident was resolved, the timeline was secure, but the saviors themselves were the final, unerasable loose ends, living out their days with the silent, heavy knowledge of what they had done.